Hey, it's Mark the Malicious Carp with 2024's Scary Goat Story for Christmas time. Now, 2024 was a particularly tough year for me. Everything's okay. We all have years like that, but unfortunately, I didn't get time to write a new story for this year. However, in 2022, I wrote a story called Roger and the Green Ribbon. And when it came time to record that one, I had a really bad head cold, so I had text to voice read it. You can find that video in the playlist. I'm going to leave it there. Search it up, watch it, enjoy it. But I always felt like I didn't give it justice, so I'm going to read it to you this year. That way I get to keep the tradition alive, and you get a interesting, entertaining, and weird goat story. So, without further ado, here is Roger and the Green Ribbon. Roger lived in a typical American suburb and never really stood out for anything, good or bad. When he was in school, he was a pretty average student and wasn't really involved in any sports or clubs. He did love math, and that passion led him through college, and he ultimately was somewhat successful in his career as an actuarial accountant. But he lived an otherwise unremarkable life. Roger was also never very lucky when it came to love. Sure, he had dated a few people throughout college, but none of them really struck him as being the one. His relationships often ended in he and his partner just growing apart until they eventually decided that it wasn't worth pursuing anymore. He worked a regular 9-to-5 office job that wasn't really conducive to meeting anyone either. That is, until one day he went to a local reindeer-themed chain coffee shop before work. He wasn't a regular there by any stretch of the imagination, but that day a new barista caught his eye. She struck Roger as being quirky, boisterous, and beautiful. There was one thing that caught Roger's eye, and that was the fact that she wore a thick green ribbon around her neck. Well, it stuck out. It did complement the uniform, so Roger didn't think much of it at the time. What he couldn't stop thinking about was her. He managed to learn that her name was Pam and that she was only a year younger than he was. They had a lot in common. They had gone to the same university, had a lot of the same interests, and were even from the same hometown. It was actually more surprising that they hadn't met before. She had just started working at the coffee shop temporarily to have an income as she was between IT consulting gigs. That day at work, Roger could hardly focus on his actuarial accounting. He longed to see her so bad that he did something he had never done before. Roger took a half day so that he could go back to that coffee shop and ask her out. She said yes, and things progressed rapidly from there. During their courtship, Roger never saw Pam without the ribbon on. Roger tried to bring up the subject many times, but Pam always deflected the discussion, saying things like, "Oh, I just like it," or, "Oh, it's not that important," or, "Don't you like it?" She also said that she was a little bit traditional, so while they were constantly around each other, they did live apart so that Roger never knew if it was the same ribbon, or if she just had like a drawer of them, or what the deal was. The night that Roger proposed, however, Pam did sit him down for a very serious discussion. "Roger," she said, looking him directly in the eyes, "you must never force me to remove the ribbon. I can't say why, but I must always wear it." Roger started to protest. He said that it didn't matter what was under there. He could handle anything because she was the most important thing. But she doubled down and said, never. They got married, and their lives went on as most do. The ribbon stayed on Pam's neck at all times, and over the years, Roger learned to live with not knowing. The topic of the ribbon would come up occasionally, but Pam would instantly shut it down with a firm no. Roger assumed that she must at least change it in private, though, because the ribbon never seemed to get soiled or frayed. Roger and Pam went on to live a very happy life, raising a family, taking vacations, their favorite being that rat-themed media conglomerate fantasy castle land, you know the one. And they owned a modest home in a beautiful part of the city. By all accounts, they had ideal lives together. That is until one day, after all their children had moved out, Roger suddenly found himself with tons of free time that he hadn't had in years. Now that there was time to idly think, Roger's curiosity about the ribbon started burning again until he couldn't take it any longer, and he devised a plan. Pam's ribbon was tied in the back in a small bow. Since the bow was usually covered by Pam's hair, it would be impossible to untie it without her knowing. Roger decided that he would wait until Pam was asleep. Then he would get out a brand new pair of fabric scissors and cut off the ribbon. Once his curiosity was satisfied, he figured that Pam would just have to accept that he knew it was under the ribbon. So he had his plan, and all he had to do was wait for the perfect night. And he didn't have to wait very long. A couple days later, Pam had a very long day at her consulting gig and was ready to go to bed right after dinner. Roger crawled into bed at his regular bedtime, but this night he made sure to keep himself awake until there was no doubt that Pam was in a deep sleep. Not that it was difficult for him to stay awake. The excitement of finally knowing the answer to this mystery that had been floating around in his mind for the last 20 years was more than enough to stimulate his mind while he waited for the perfect moment. At around midnight, he decided it was time. Roger slowly slid out of bed. He collected a flashlight and his scissors, and then went and stood over Pam. As he watched her sleep, he remembered all the great times they had had together and had fleeting second thoughts about doing this. After all, never removing the ribbon was the one and only rule that Pam had set for him. But at this point, he couldn't take it any longer. The idea of never knowing what was under the ribbon was enough to drive him mad. So against his better judgment, he slowly lifted the scissors and placed them under part of the ribbon. He gave it a quick snip, about an inch up, just to make sure the scissors could cleanly cut the ribbon. It worked, so he snipped it again, about halfway this time. At this point, he decided there was no going back. He slid the scissors the rest of the way up the ribbon. Pam squirmed a bit in her sleep as she felt the cold metal of the scissors on her neck. Roger waited a bit to make sure he didn't disturb her too much, and once he was sure she was still asleep, he took a deep breath and snipped it the rest of the way. At that very instant, Roger woke up in his usual bed of straw in his enclosure. He couldn't believe the dream he had just had. He looked over at Pam, who was laying right next to him like she always was. Her horns and goatee looked as beautiful as they always did. She was wearing a bit of ribbon around her neck, but the people had put it there. Roger knew that. He was jealous of it, but Pam was proud of the ribbon, and she deserved to wear it. Roger got up to check the manger for food. He found a bit still in there and slowly chewed it while he contemplated the dream that he had just had. What was under Human Pam's ribbon? Why wouldn't she let him see it? Why was he so obsessed with it? And why did his brain decide that he would be a garbage human being who couldn't respect boundaries in his very own dream? And what the heck was actuarial accounting anyways? Why would anyone want to do that? After a short time pondering these deep questions, he gave up. Roger bleated softly to comfort himself and then made his way back to bed. He tucked his hooves in nice and tight and fell back asleep. The end. And Merry Christmas.